A homeless man named George is protected every night by a golden retriever named Max, who braves the cold and perils of the city streets. But more than Max's devotion, what's really amazing is what transpires next permanently alters both of their lives. George had been homeless for years. Max was his lone friend as he lived day by day, forgotten by civilization. Max was more than simply a friend. He was a stray dog who had shown up one icy winter night and never left his side. Their nights were frequently occupied with George's guardian keeping watch while he slept and warning him of any dangers. With difficulties, irate people endure inclement weather and constant uncertainty of life without shelter. Yet Max's steadfast devotion made George feel. Max appeared to sense George's fragility and gave him a sense of security he hadn't had in years, standing between him and any danger, especially cold ones, and cuddling up next to him to share warmth. Max's ears pricked up as George dozed asleep when they took their customary location by an abandoned alley in the evening. Max kept his ground and barked as a man came into view from the shadows, alerting him to something strange, vehemently to dissuade any danger. But what followed would start a series of events that neither George nor Max could control. Could have envisioned George waking up to Max's yelling, his heart racing as he rapidly evaluated his. A few steps away, a man stood motionless in the shadow of a fading streetlight. His hands were raised in a surrendering gesture, his face displaying a simple mixture of wonder and terror. Placing a hand on Max's back, Boy George said, the golden retriever's tense. Although his posture gradually eased, his eyes remained fixed on the stranger. I'm not. I just saw the dog, the man added, his voice quivering a little, here to hurt you, and want to see how things were doing. George didn't answer right away because years of adversity had taught him to be. We're all right, but be wary of strangers, he warned sternly, drawing his thin blanket closer. The man hesitated around his shoulders before reaching into his coat pocket, snarled softly, but George reassured him by gently patting his side as the man withdrew. A paper-wrapped lunch and held it out to George, who accepted it, saying it was. After giving the offering a weary glance, fresh George eventually accepted it. Thank you, whispered, slicing off a tiny piece and passing it to Max, who sniffed it before consuming the remainder, which George swiftly gobbled up. I'm Paul, the man added, sitting on a nearby crate, and I own a cafe a few blocks away. The modest meal was filling his empty stomach. George looked at him, not knowing how to interpret this stranger, and I've seen you and your dog around a few times from here. Paul shrugged and said, I used to have a dog like him. Why do you care? Max stayed attentive, his warm body crushed against his, as the two guys whispered warily, reminding me of her. Paul saw the connection between them and grinned warmly against George's side. Loyal Paul said that few dogs would remain like way. George nodded. Max. Paul listened as George described how he's more than just a dog. He's family. He saved my life more times than I can count. One evening, Max had looked thin and shivering, but George had seen a glimmer of resolve in his eyes, shared his little lunch with them, and they became inseparable that night. He keeps watch over me, George remarked. Keeps me safe. I don't know how I'd get by without him. A huge crash near Max cut off the talk. Paul jumped to his feet and began barking protectively. His face was strained as he remarked, This neighborhood isn't safe at night. George said sourly, You two shouldn't be out here. Where else would we go? Paul paused, then unexpectedly offered to come to my cafe tomorrow. I'll make sure to. You both have a hot meal with no conditions attached. George was dubious, but reluctantly accepted as Paul left, and Max sat next to George, wagging his tail a little as though he could see the stranger had good intentions. The following day, George and Max headed to the cafe, where the aroma of freshly made coffee and baked goodies permeated the air, providing a sharp contrast to. Paul welcomed them with a plate of food and a bowl of water for Max on the abrasive streets for the first time. Over the next few weeks, George experienced a tiny glimmer of hope for the first time in years. George and Max saw Paul's generosity as a lifeline, and the cafe turned into a secure space where they could relax and rejuvenate. Despite this, Paul was so moved by Max's devotion that he began putting leftover food outdoors for other stray dogs in the neighborhood. Despite the increased support, George's existence on the streets was a daily struggle, with onlookers constantly criticizing him, and, although Max's protective instinct occasionally caused arguments, they always had each other. And now they also. George and Max went back to their location in the alley one rainy evening after having Paul. Max nestled up next to George as he leaned against the wall and pulled his coat tighter as the cold seeped into his bones. George thought about the life he had lost, a stable career, a home, and golden fur that was damp but still warm. He gazed down at Max, who was already asleep, and felt the simple comfort of not having to struggle for survival every day. As George fell asleep, he mumbled, "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, buddy," feeling a pang of thankfulness. Max was on guard, but he failed to notice the shadowy figure observing them from the opposite end of the alley. The figure paused as he became alert, and a deep growl rumbled in his throat, vanished into the night. And when George awoke the following morning, he discovered a tiny box close to their resting area. Included a note from Max and his courageous owner, a blanket, and a bag of dog food. For the first time in years, George felt noticed as his eyes began to flood up with tears. He saw Max, who joyfully wagged his tail, and felt a sense of worth, not simply as a homeless man. Feeling of resolve as the dawn rose, George silently promised himself, and when George and Max reached Paul's, they realized that their journey was far from finished, but they would tackle it together, one step at a time. Cafe early the following morning, while the city skyline was being illuminated by the first rays of dawn, the warmth of the cafe with its enticing aroma of freshly baked goods and coffee stood in sharp contrast to the freezing streets Max wagged in. Paul welcomed them with a sincere smile, his golden fur sparkling in the sunlight as he joyfully waggled his tail. "Good morning," Paul stated, placing a plate full of toast and scrambled eggs and a hot cup of coffee for Max. "Put some leftover roast chicken from the previous day's meal in a dish of fresh water. You appear to need a appropriate lunch." George carefully sat down, still unfamiliar with this sudden friendliness. Max started eating right away, his tail thumping joyfully. Picking at his toast, George said, "I don't know how to thank you," to which Paul answered, "You don't have to. I can see how much you care for Max from where I sit, and that type of devotion is worthy of encouragement." When Paul asked George about his life, George hesitantly started to talk. He talked about his previous stable work in construction, his small apartment, and his aspirations to eventually buy his own house. However, he was left without a safety net when the company he worked for failed, and his landlord was evicted. When he most needed them, he and his pals vanished. Max had entered his life at his lowest point, offering him a. George scratched the dog behind his ears and added, "Max saved me." Paul listened carefully to his face, which was a mixture of adoration and sympathy. "He's the only family I have. Most people in your situation would have given up, but you're still here, and that's stronger than you think," he remarked. "Says a lot." George, who wasn't used to hearing words, gazed down at his coffee, his throat constricted with emotion. Of support, particularly from someone he hardly knew. "I suppose I'm a loss for options," he said over the. In the weeks that followed, George and Max found refuge at Paul's cafe, where regulars started to recognize them, and some even brought treats for Max, who delighted everyone with his amiable manner. But some customers weren't being welcomed. Murmured behind George's back one afternoon, casting critical looks at his old features and shabby clothes as Max and George were sitting in their typical corner when a well-dressed man came up to Paul at the counter. "I've seen that man, and his dog has been around a lot lately," and he said in a sharp tone, "Isn't it detrimental to business to have people like that around?" Although Paul's jaw tensed, he spoke calmly. "George and Max are my guests. As with everyone else that enters, you are free to take your time if you have any issues." Paul was furious with George when the man huffed and rushed away, leaving business elsewhere. Paul stopped the person who had overheard the exchange from gathering his belongings after experiencing a similar pang of shame. He replied firmly, "Don't let people like that get to you." George nodded. "You belong here just as much as anyone else." Max leaned into him, realizing that words would not help ease the tightness in his stomach. George soothed his uneasiness by licking his palm and grinning subtly, appreciative of his constant company. One night, when George and Max went back to their location in the alley, they discovered a There were some teens hanging there, and their laughter reverberated off the brick walls. But George wasn't amicable. As one of the boys went forward, tensing Max and drawing him closer, the boy sneered and said, "Nice dog. I bet you'll get a good price." George responded, "Leave us alone." The child grinned, but his tone was hard and steady. Max moved in front of George before he could say anything more, gritting his teeth and snarling at the other boys. Nervously withdrew, bringing their ringleader along, but one of. When they vanished into the night, George knelt next to Max and put his arms around him, saying, "Good boy he." George was shaken by the experience, but it also made him think, "You've got my back, don't you?" Bolstered his determination that he couldn't continue to live this tense, vulnerable life. Max deserved better, and so did he. George went back to the cafe the following morning, resolved to sit with Paul and seek his opinion. George described his circumstances over coffee, saying, "I can't do this anymore. Acknowledge that Max, who lives on the streets and is constantly watching me, deserves a." Paul nodded thoughtfully, saying, "I might have an idea, but I've been thinking about that too." George's interest was piqued, so he said, "What kind of work will it take?" Paul grinned, "And let's just say you're not the only one who needs another opportunity. Come see me here tomorrow, and I'll go over everything with you first thing tomorrow." Paul welcomed George and Max with his customary friendliness as they arrived at the cafe, their breath evident in the clear morning air. He murmured, "Come with me," clutching his coat inquisitively, yet there was a fresh gleam of resolve in his eyes. Hesitantly, George jogged with Paul and his tail when they left the Café Max. Paul led them to a small, rundown structure a few blocks away while they were walking through the busy streets. Paul unlocked the Second Chance's shelter sign that was displayed above the door and led them inside. The room was barely lighted, the walls had flaking paint, and there was a slight mildew odor. But it was roomy, with multiple rooms extending from the main hall. Paul stated, his voice tinted with nostalgia, that this was once a community center that had been abandoned for years. "However, I've been repairing it because I want to use it as a sanctuary for people like you and their animals," George shocked a refuge for persons with pets by staring at Paul, who nodded. "There are far too many shelters that refuse to accept animals, leaving people like you without a place to go. This location could be changing at times, offering folks a genuine opportunity to get back on their feet without having to." George's throat clenched as he surveyed the room. The thought of giving up the creatures they love felt almost too sweet too. Paul grinned. "So that's where you need to be honest about how you want to make this work. Come on in. I need someone I can rely on to help me manage this place. Someone who understands what it's like." George blinked as he tried to take in Paul's comments, wondering if there was anyone out there who could relate to the folks we were attempting to aid. "You want me to help you, but I'm just trying to survive, and you've been doing that while I have no experience." "Better than most," Paul stated emphatically. "You have empathy, George, and grit are things that cannot be taught." And he smiled, adding that Max would make a fantastic mascot. George looked at Max, who gave him a trusting expression as though to say, "We can do this," but George wasn't sure. Gradually, "It sounds too large." Paul touched George's shoulder and said, "I'm not requesting an answer at this time. Please consider it. Return tomorrow, and we'll continue our conversation that evening." As George and Max took up their normal position, but George couldn't help thinking about Paul's suggestion that there should be a purpose. He felt both joy and worry when he thought of creating anything significant again. Could he actually achieve it? Max cuddled up next to him, resting his head on George's shoulder, leaving behind the life he had grown to accept as his reality. George felt a glimmer of resolve as he caressed Max's velvety fur. "What do you think, buddy?" he whispered. "Think we can start over?" Max's tail pounded the floor as though he agreed. Paul was waiting for them with a clipboard in hand when George returned to the shelter the following morning. Max at his side. He asked, "Does this mean you're in?" with a smile of quiet certainty on his face. George took a long breath and nodded. "I'm in." Paul taught George the fundamentals of running the shelter during the following few weeks, which turned into their joint effort, arranging supplies, managing volunteers, and keeping the structure in good condition. George then contributed his own thoughts, offering suggestions on how to improve the shelter's effectiveness and friendliness. began to greet everyone who entered the room with a wagging tail and seemingly endless enthusiasm. His upbeat demeanor made people feel better and more at ease. As soon as word got out about the refuge, people began to arrive, each with a unique story of adversity, each accompanied by a faithful friend. One evening while George was cleaning the main hall, a woman came with a tiny, quivering terrier clutched her face and her garments in her arms. "I heard about this place," she remarked quietly. "Is it true that you take in people and their pets?" George sat exhausted. He put down his broom and walked over to her, his face soft. "That's right. You're safe here." And tears filled the woman's eyes. "George, I've been turned away so many times that I didn't know where else to go." Her gaze scanned the refuge. "You don't need to explain," he said. "We've been there, so you're not alone," and led her to a chair and handed her a blanket. However, as the woman and her terrier took up residence in one of the newly decorated rooms at the shelter that evening, George sat next to Max and considered how far they had come. The shelter was now a lifeline rather than just a structure, location where individuals might rebuild their lives and find hope. And for the first time in years, George felt a sense of pride for Max as much as for himself, whose steadfast devotion had brought. As of right now, the shelter's initial weeks of operation were a flurry of activity characterized by both minor successes and major obstacles George had as he adapted to his new position as being a manager and caretaker was both exciting and demanding. The framework and duties provided him a sense of direction had not experienced in years, but they also forced him to step outside of his comfort zone. Nevertheless, he adjusted. The residents of the shelter loved the golden retriever because of his easygoing nature and upbeat attitude. As though he were the shelter's steward, Max would trot along the hallways every morning to see how each visitor and their dogs were doing. Official ambassador, whose presence served as a soothing reminder that everyone was a part of something greater than. George found himself sitting at the little desk in the main hall's corner one morning, poring over a list of donations George was left in charge of after Paul went to get supplies. When George looked up from his job that day, he saw Max snooping on the leg of a teenage lad who was seated on a bench. George stood, a little older than 16, clutching a leash on a shabby mutt who cowed behind his legs. He walked up to them, his boots scuffing lightly on the floor, and said, "Good morning," with a tiny smile. My mother added, "I heard this place helps people with dogs," and the youngster nodded, his eyes darting nervously about the room. I couldn't just leave him, but I couldn't keep him either. George bent down to look into the boy's eyes, and his voice reassured him. "Did you come here correctly? What's his name?" The boy paused before responding, and Spike George held out a hand. Regarding the dog that cautiously smelled it before wagging his tail, George exclaimed, "Good boy, and you too can remain as." The boy's shoulders relaxed in relief as you needed him to, and he smiled tentatively for the first time. In the meantime, the shelter was beginning to receive notice from a neighborhood, and some people were helpful, giving money and giving their time to others, but were less hospitable. One afternoon, George heard two men outside the shelter speaking quietly. He couldn't understand why. One of them said, "Those people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps because they're wasting resources on a place like this." George's jaw tensed, but he refrained from speaking because the confrontation wouldn't change their opinions. So he used his annoyance to strengthen the shelter's resolve to demonstrate its worth taking action. Later that day, Paul brought back a truck full of goods, and George told him about the George acknowledged leaning against the truck, "But I believe we've got a lot of work ahead of us." Paul gave him a shoulder clap, saying, "You're doing great, George. Without you and Max, this area wouldn't be what it is." Naturally, Max agreed, and wagging his tail as though to state that we work as a team. Over time, George saw that he was more. Routines that had previously been intimidating now made him feel proud and more self-assured. Additionally, he enjoyed the little things, like seeing a visitor's face light up as their dog played with Max, or hearing a thank you from someone who, after months of worry, felt secure at last. However, one night as George, a woman with a bleeding arm and a scared chihuahua in her arms, arrived at the shelter as it was closing for the night. "They wouldn't let me stay," she murmured, her arms trembling and her eyes wide with terror. George led her inside and assisted her in cleaning the wound while Max remained nearby, causing her voice to break. The woman, who could see she was upset, revealed that she had been rejected from another shelter due to her dog. With nowhere to go, George listened and had a familiar pang of. He was filled with despair and rage as he recalled all the times he had been rejected and how it felt to be treated as though he didn't matter. But in this location, things were different and people were important. His voice was forceful as he told her that their stories mattered and that you were secure. George thought about how far they had come with the shelter that evening when he and Max were sitting on the porch. It wasn't flawless. There were still obstacles to get over and skeptics to persuade, but it was developing and changing. Max rested on George, his golden fur warm in the porch light, and entered a realm of healing and optimism. Caressed his head, thinking about the future. "We're doing well, buddy," he said. "Let's keep." As the weeks passed, Max's tail thudded against the porch in that manner, silently pledging that they were in this together. Passed into months, the refuge developed into a center of resiliency and hope. But as the complexity of managing such an organization increased along with the number of guests, and George B. dedicated to gaining personal knowledge that good intentions were not always sufficient. Paul summoned George into the tiny office one morning, and they both had a pile of bills on the desk in respective corners. "We're running low," Paul muttered, collapsing beneath the weight of a coffee cup. His typical optimism was replaced with worry that donations had slowed, and we'll need more supplies for folks and their dogs as winter approaches. George scowled. Paul said, leaning against the doorway, "Is it so bad that we might have to start turning people away?" The hesitant tone he used made George's stomach turn because he had been in their position, cold, desperate, and burdened with the thought of sending someone. It seemed intolerable to return to that state of uncertainty while trying to figure something out. George firmly stated, "We always do." As the day went on, George considered the possibilities. Solutions, grant applications, and even contacting nearby companies for sponsorship all appeared far away. Alternatives, but they had to act right away after noticing George's discomfort, remained near his golden eyes, which were full of silent encouragement. As George walked into the main hall that night in a comfortable, a figure entered the room. It was Josh, the teenage kid who had arrived with. Weeks before, his dog Spike was carrying a guitar, so I thought I could assist Josh, who tugged at his lips with a hesitant smile. "I've been playing on the street. I thought that if I put spare change in these corners, maybe some individuals might donate." George felt proud. "That's a great idea, kid. Let's set you up." Words swiftly, and in a matter of days, the front lawn of the shelter was transformed into a gathering spot. Josh performed soulful tunes while Max proudly sat beside him, attracting passersby who stopped to listen as he dropped cash into a tin can. George, who was designated for the shelter, was astounded by how rapidly the community came around to support them. But not everyone was. Encouraging one afternoon when a small group of people cheered Josh's performance as a man approached George in a suit. His clipped tone and stern demeanor were enough to make George uneasy. "I'm here from the man said, brandishing a badge, that the city council had received complaints regarding noise and traffic disturbances. Because of your actions, George became irate while attempting to assist others. Some of these people have raised an eyebrow at this shelter, and I understand that you have to follow the city's rules. This arrangement may be breaking zoning restrictions." The comment struck George like a kick to the belly. The man said, "I'm saying you need to fix this," before leaving for the day, stating that we could have to close. As he sat on the porch with Max the following evening, George felt completely defeated for the first time since opening the refuge. Max put his head on George's lap as the situation's weight weighed heavily on him, serving as a reminder of how far they'd. "Boy," George said, "come, I don't know what to do," in an emotionally charged voice. "Even though it seems like we're losing," Max the optimist gently nudged George's palm while his tail was waving. The following day, Paul proposed that they arrange a meeting with. "If we're going to fight this, we need everyone on board," he added, referring to the shelter's residents. George agreed, but he wasn't sure. When the shelter's visitors assembled in the main hall that evening, Josh sat with Spike at his table to discuss what they could do. The elderly man with the German shepherd rested on the feet of the young mother and her kids, who were huddled in a corner. "We've struck a hard point," George said steadily as he stood against the wall in front of Max. "Despite the internal strife, this location is worth fighting for because families remain together and we are now a family." There were murmurs of agreement across the room. Josh held up his hand and said, "What can we do to help George?" He smiled slightly. "We'll need to come up with creative strategies to generate money, win over the city council, and demonstrate that this refuge is important." In the days that followed, the shelter was a hive of activities. Paul invited members of the local media to observe the work being done. Josh and the other residents planned a community open house that included tours of the property, live music performances, and pet adoption events. Max, the shelter's top attraction, captivated guests with his naughty antics and steadfast devotion. People who had previously questioned the shelter's mission started to recognize its importance once the open house was a huge success. An emotional piece about George's journey and the shelter's influence was published by a local journalist, which sparked an outpouring of assistance. Volunteers donated their time and expertise, and contributions came in. However, the argument continued when George and Paul brought shelter testimonies to a municipal council meeting. Letters from supporters and residents. George, despite his nervousness, spoke from the heart. "This refuge is more than simply a roof," he said steadily above people's heads. "It's a lifeline, a place where," he said, "that people and their dogs can discover hope, dignity, and safety." Max sat at. Following the hours of liberation, the council's presence and his feet serve as a mute testament to the connection between people and animals. Decided to extend the shelter's time to resolve the zoning difficulties. It wasn't a total win, but it was a positive start. The correct path. George felt lighter after the encounter and returned with renewed resolve to the. As if sensing his progress, Shelter Max greeted him with a boisterous bark, and George knelt next to him, scratching behind his ears. "Friend, we're not done yet, but we're making progress." George was under increasing strain as the shelter carried on with its activities under the cloud of zoning difficulties, even though, despite the council's temporary extension and the support of the community, he was unable to eliminate the impending uncertainty around the shelters. Future Max was always on guard and rarely left his side, providing consolation in the midst of. After a particularly exhausting day of meetings and preparation, George found himself sitting in the storm one evening. Ma sat by herself in the shelter's common area, which was often a pleasant and lively space, but now looked uncannily quiet. Paul came in with two, his head resting on George's old boots. Before he sat across from George, he brought him a mug of coffee. "You've been awfully quiet today," Paul said. George sipped his steaming coffee, his eyes averted as he thought, his voice light but filled with worry. After a brief pause, Paul said, "What if this doesn't work out? If we lose the shelter, we're not losing it. It's not only about me, Paul. These people are dogs." George sighed, reclining back in his chair. "Not without a fight." Paul's face softened. "But you're not letting them down, and I feel like I'm failing them now. Anyone who is depressed should glance around. You're the reason this place exists." George shook his head when they ran out of optimism, saying that it wasn't enough to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, Josh, who had been listening from the corridor, he carefully approached and asked, "Can I talk to you guys?" Paul nodded hesitantly. Josh sat down his hands and said, "What's on your mind?" For him to join them. Nervously squirming, "I've been considering reaching out to some of the folks I've met through performing. This man who runs a recording studio has always told me that I have promise. Perhaps he would be ready to assist us in raising." George's heart swelled with pride as he studied the adolescent with more money. Josh nodded firmly. "Big step, kid. Are you sure you want to do that?" This location gave. Later that evening, when the shelter was quiet and most people had gone home, I wanted to give Spike and myself another chance. Residents went to their rooms, and George and Max strolled outdoors. The night air was clear, and the sky was covered in stars. "Do you ever feel like the world is too heavy?" Boy George whispered as he sat on the porch steps, petting behind Max's ears. Max answered by nuzzling his thigh and whining softly, as though on cue. Amanda, a young mother from the shelter, went outside with a blanket slung over her shoulders and a boiling. "Do you mind if I join you for a cup of tea?" George agreed, and she chose the He truly looks up to you, Amanda added after a little pause. I saw you talking to Josh earlier. I'm just an old man trying to prevent everything from falling apart. And I'm not sure why George laughed so hard. Amanda's eyes. George, you're more than that. You provided a safe haven for all of us. That's not all. George glanced down at Max, his hand still caressing the dog's golden coat, although occasionally I ponder whether. Amanda agreed that I'm doing the right thing by taking on all of this. It's a lot. Her comments, but you're not alone, we're all in this together, lingered in the air as a subdued reminder of their shared community. Constructed George sensed a glimmer of hope, brittle yet present the following day, Josh's. With Paul's assistance, the idea started to take shape. He got in touch with the proprietor of the recording studio. They consented to record a song and host a modest concert in order to generate money for the shelter's residents. Came together to support Josh's preparations and spread the word as the concert drew near. The shelter buzzed. Maxie became more animated than ever as he sensed the shift in the atmosphere, wagging his tail, and, on the night of the event, the venue's brilliant eyes lifted everyone's spirits. George stood in the rear of the crowded local community hall, with Max at his side. The teenager's hands shook a little as he adjusted the microphone as he watched Josh take the stage. But Josh's voice was powerful and primal as it started to play, and the crowd went quiet. Note bearing the burden of his voyage, the audience was enthralled, and their reactions were a mixture of awe and George felt emotional when the room exploded in applause at the conclusion of the performance. As he observed Josh bow and Spike waving his tail next to him, a knot formed at his throat. For the first time in weeks, George gave himself permission to think that they might just survive this back-at. Josh went up to George at the shelter that evening and said, "Thank you for believing in me." His voice was solid but quiet. George, as Josh left, put a hand on the teen's shoulder and said, "How did you do that on your own, kid? I'm proud of you." Turned to Max. "We're not done yet, boy." Although this evening was enjoyable because following the city council's decision, shelter gained speed, but new difficulties emerged. This time, on a very personal level, George had always thought that giving second chances was important. But as the sun peaked in one morning, he had no idea how convoluted those chances may become. Paul approached George hesitantly through the large windows of the shelter. "We have a new arrival," he said. George gestured toward the entrance and followed Paul, seeing a rumpled man seated on a bench. The man appeared to shrink as his eyes darted nervously about the room while he clutched a leash on a rumpled terrier. "This is Rick, Paul, who has been living on the streets for years and claims to have heard everything." George, the town's shelter provider, held out his hand, but Rick paused before giving him a feeble shake. "A place for me and my dog Rick," who asked in a harsh voice after years of struggle. "We'll make room," George said, "but there are rules. No fighting, no stealing. And everyone pitches in, believing you can handle that." Rick nodded slightly, tightening his hold on the leash, saying, "I'll try." Over the next few days, it became evident that Rick was having trouble adjusting. He avoided eye contact and stayed to himself. His terrier Toby was as cautious about yelling at people when he made contact with other residents. Somebody approached too closely one evening while George was strolling in the communal area of the shelter. When he discovered Rick sitting alone himself, Toby cuddled himself at his feet, and Max carefully approached. He waved his tail in a welcoming manner, but Toby snarled and bared his teeth. Rick, the boy, patted Toby's head and said, "Hello, George. Please sit down." The man across from Rick inquired, "Are you settling in okay?" Rick shrugged and said, "I guess I haven't seen this many people in years." George nodded. "All right. It's difficult, but we're all in this together, so you're not alone." Rick looked at George, and his face softened a little. "Thank you very much." However, there were some obstacles in Rick's path. A week later, Paul discovered him fighting with another resident over a lost blanket. The shelter was tense, and everyone's attention was drawn to the voices that erupted. "Hey, George." Rick's face was red with rage as he stepped between them and barked, "Taking my blanket since I needed it." Marcus, an older president, shook his head at Toby, "But I didn't steal anything. Instead, I discovered it in the..." George lifted a hand to silence them both, saying, "This isn't how we handle laundry." He turned to Rick and firmly stated, "Let's talk outside once." Rick was pacing back and forth outdoors, clearly frustrated. "I'm trying, George," he muttered, his voice shaking, "but it's hard." George put his hand on Rick's shoulder and grounded him, saying, "Don't trust people, and Toby's all I have." "I understand," he murmured, gently, "but you have more than Toby now. Let's assist Rick take a look at." George said, "I don't know if I can," his eyes sparkling with unshed tears. George answered steadily, "You can. It's not easy, but you've already taken the first step, which is more than most people do." Rick went over to Marcus that night and quietly apologized. Though it was a modest gesture, it was a turning point. Gradually, Rick started interacting with the other inhabitants, and Toby warmed up to the dog nearby. The diplomat appeared to take Toby under his wing, including Max at all times. Two canines developed an unbreakable friendship, reflecting the increasing trust between Rick and the community that was observing them at the shelter. One very frigid night, George discovered a renewed feeling of purpose. Toby was lying next to Rick as he sat outside the shelter, gazing up at the sky. George inquired, sitting upon the steps, "Is everything okay?" Rick nodded, but the small body was snuggled close for warmth. His face was solemn as he considered how long he had been fleeing. George, looking at him thoughtfully with his worn face, said, "I don't know if I can ever stop people for myself." "You've already." Rick stopped running and shakily exhaled. "You're here, that's what matters." "I'm afraid, George. Afraid of ruining this. Afraid of disappointing Toby completely." Frightened, George acknowledged. But for the first time, Rick grinned and said, "You don't have to do this alone. We've got your back." A slight hesitation, but sincere gratitude. "George, I truly mean it." As the weeks passed, Rick established himself as a vital member of the shelter by assisting with everyday tasks and demonstrating his mechanical abilities. Because of his significant assistance in fixing damaged fixtures, the locals started to view him as a member of their family rather than an outsider. As George proudly saw Rick's change, the formerly guarded and closed-off man was now advising novices and even showing Josh how to repair a leaky foray. Toby's playful nature had also flourished, making everyone happy. Rick came over with a cup of coffee while George sat by the fire that evening, Max at his feet. "I've been thinking, maybe I could help run things here. Pay it," he remarked in a tentative tone. "I think you'd be good at it, Rick." Forward, George smiled warmly. George felt a great sense of contentment as they sat in friendly silence. The shelter wasn't only a refuge for people. They were able to restore their lives and relationships at refuge. The future seemed more promising than ever as winter's cold hold on city life tightened. Much like Rick stepping up, the rush of individuals brought on by the cold made shelter a delicate balancing act. The resources of the shelter are being overtaxed by creatures seeking refuge. But George, experienced in crisis management, they were unable to overlook the mounting pressure on their tiny village one chilly January morning. "We have an issue," Paul remarked solemnly as he walked up to George, who scowled as he held up an envelope, bringing the document inside, which was a city warning that if the shelter doesn't comply, an inspection will be conducted soon. Paul clarified that we might be subject to fines or worse under the new health and safety regulations. George shut down, feeling the burden of responsibility bearing down on him. Paul said, "How long do we have?" 2 weeks is hardly enough time to take care of everything. Rick, a resident who had grown to be a trusted source, was shadowed by the story as it swiftly circulated around the shelter. One of them drew George aside and asked, "What can we do to help?" Speaking steadily in spite of the anxiety, George paused before answering. "There's a lot to fix, including plumbing and heating." Rick nodded. "We need to demonstrate to the city that our operations are sustainable through structural repairs." Then, under Rick's direction, "Let's get to work." The shelter's occupants banded together, especially the carpenters. Abilities fixed damaged furniture and patched wall holes, while others diligently scrubbed every. Even Toby and Max appeared to provide their amusing antics to raise spirits throughout the surface's glistening. Arduous procedure, and in spite of their best efforts, the difficulties continued to grow. One night, the heating system failed, and everyone was wrapped in blankets for hours. "George and Rick, we need a new system," Rick stated at last, as they tinkered with the ancient furnace, their breath evident in the chilly air. George scratched his temples and said, "This is beyond saving." Rick mentioned a hardware store downtown that the owner used to visit, so perhaps we don't have to. Perhaps he will contribute a unit or at least offer us a discount for community dinners. The following morning, George and Rick went to the proprietor, a burly man named Sam, is faithfully walking beside the store. Max looked at them doubtfully and replied, "George, it's been a while. What brought you here?" While crossing his arms, he spoke in a measured tone as he described the problem. "But we're doing everything we can, Sam, but we need assistance. For these people, the shelter is everything." Sam looked at Rick and then at Maxan, who wagging his tail in the hopes that, after a lengthy silence, Sam sighed, "I'll see what I can do," but he couldn't promise that there wasn't much. Sam eventually consented to contribute an older but still effective heating unit, though, and Rick fitted it with. Paul's assistance and the warmth it provided to the shelter served as a beacon of hope during the coldest of times, both literally and figuratively. Tensions increased once more as the inspection date drew near, since the shelter's financial records were lacking, and George spent restless nights going through donation logs and invoices because the city needed evidence of consistent funding. One evening, Rick discovered George hunched over the office desk with his head in his hands as his irritation grew. "I'm trying to make sense of this," Rick replied, placing down a steaming cup of coffee. "Looks like you've been through the ringer." Rick hesitated, but George said tiredly, "If we don't get these numbers right, it won't matter how clean the shelter is." Before he spoke, George thought, "What if we organized a fundraiser to engage the community?" Rick shrugged and asked, "Why not?" as he narrowed his eyes at a benefit in less than a week. "Many people in this town are aware of the goodwill we provide, so let's remind them." Rick and Paul established the flyers were made and sent to nearby businesses in order to organize a pause and people event at the shelter, provided materials, and information swiftly went viral on social media. The event included kid-friendly activities, a bake sale, and a display of the shelter's canines, including Max as the main draw for locals, and volunteers put in countless hours to prepare their common goal, which energized the group on the day of. When they arrived, the shelter was bustling with activity, with families waiting in line to meet the dogs. Rick was in charge of the grill, turning burgers with unexpected talent, while the kids played tug-of-war with Max. The atmosphere was electrified, demonstrating the shelter's tenacity. As the celebration came to a close, George addressed the audience. He started his speech by saying, "This shelter isn't just a roof over our heads. It's a place where people and animals find hope and family. And it's a voice full of heart. Can't do this without you." By the end of the event, the applause was loud and the donation jars were brimming with cash. That evening, the shelter generated enough money to cover further renovations and satisfy the city's standards. As the people rejoiced, George drew Rick aside and whispered, "You made this happen," in a tone of gratitude. "I don't." Rick grinned and looked contrite, knowing what we would have done without you. "George, you gave me another chance." Max and Toby curled up close to me as they stood in the shelter's warm glow, my way of giving back. As the inspection approached, George experienced a renewed sense of hope since, for the first time in weeks, they felt as though they have As the refuge adapted to its newfound harmony, fighting chance appeared to have established a nearly predictable cadence, and George and Rick collaborated to keep everything running smoothly. Max and Toby kept up their nighttime patrols to make sure everyone was safe, but below this expanding community, the storm was approaching that would put their fortitude and solidarity to the test. It started one chilly evening when George got a letter with a municipal council symbol. His heart fell. The council had determined to review the shelter's zoning permission in light of recent worries expressed by nearby companies. Basically, Rick discovered George sitting on the front porch reading the letter. The shelter was once more in danger of closing. Gripped in his palm, asking in a worried tone, "What's wrong?" Without saying a word, George gave him the letter. Rick's jaw tightened as he read it. His forehead wrinkled. "They can't do this. They can't after everything we've done," George replied in a somber voice. "We have 30 days to demonstrate that we are not a nuisance, or otherwise they will cancel our permit." Rick's hand clenched. and this location saved my George. We cannot allow them to remove it off the news because it is saving many lives. As word of the letter circulated throughout the shelter, inmates experienced a surge of anxiety, and some started packing belongings, possessions, fearing they would have to return to the streets. Others gathered around George, desperate to defend their home. Max, aware of the stress, remained near George, his amber eyes full of. Toby, the follower, echoed Max's attentiveness with concern, snarling gently. Rick decided to rally the residents after noticing that someone appeared really anxious. "We have a month," he remarked. "There is ample opportunity to explain to the council the significance of this location during an unplanned meeting in the common area. Not only to us, but to the entire community." Rick's determination sparked a wave of activity that some locals started writing letters to the council, while others made requests for assistance, even from nearby companies and places of worship. Josh, who tended to keep to himself, offered to make a film that would highlight the shelter's impact. Testimonies from both neighbors and residents. But as the days passed, the pressure increased. One evening, George discovered Rick in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "You okay?" George said, setting a calming hand on Rick's shoulder. Rick let out a trembling breath. "I'm just afraid, George." George caught Rick's stare, his own eyes calm. "But what if it's not enough? What if we lose everything? We've been through worse, and we've always emerged stronger." Rick nodded, but there was still uncertainty in his eyes. I. George stated clearly that you're not doing this alone and that you don't want to disappoint anyone. In the meantime, Max and Toby grew into an unexpected team in their own right as they patrolled the shelter grounds together at night, strengthening their relationship, becoming more powerful every day, as though Max had taken Toby under his wing and taught him the rope hopes of being a guardian. George felt a pang of pride one evening as he saw them outside his window. These dogs weren't only companions. They served as representations of the shelter's tenacity and optimism, but not all of the. One morning, George saw graffiti scrawled across the shelter's walls, demonstrating the community's support for their work. The words were big, ominous, and oozing with fresh paint on the front wall. George was so chilled by the sight that he summoned Rick and Paul over there. Rick mumbled, his fists clenched, "Looks like someone wants us gone," as their expressions darkened as they processed the information. Paul sadly agreed. "We should call the police about this," but George paused. "We can't. This is just paint, so don't be intimidated. We'll clean it up and go on." Rick stepped forward, his firm voice. "No, this is more than paint. Whoever did it is a threat. This believes they can intimidate us into giving up. So we must prove them incorrect." Later that day, when a local television crew comes on, arrived after being tipped off by a shelter supporter while the reporter spoke with George Day. Rick in graffiti in the background served as a clear reminder to many occupants of the resistance they encountered. This shelter isn't. Despite the anxiety, George replied in a steady voice, "Just a building," adding that it's a lifeline and evidence that people can alter the fact that second chances are important. "We're not leaving." Rick is standing next to. He nodded. "We've faced more difficult situations than this, and each time we've emerged stronger." Because of the outpouring of support, the news story that night presented the refuge in a sympathetic manner. Residents' spirits were raised by watchers throughout the city. However, the graffiti event left a lasting feeling of tensions inside the refuge reached a breaking point as the 30-day deadline drew near, and disputes broke out over minor problems, and some residents started to question their prospects of success. George held a meeting in a calm but forceful tone. "I know things feel impossible right now," he said to the group, "but we've come too far to give up this. Because of all of you, the shelter has survived. Let's demonstrate to the council what that means." Rick moved forward and spoke steadily, saying, "We have one more opportunity to present our case. Let's make it matter." That evening, when George opened his door after hearing the gentle shuffling of paws outside, he discovered Max and Toby seated there. With nearly somber expressions on their faces, George knelt down and ruffled their fur. He said, "Don't worry, lads. We'll overcome the burden of the impending." Everyone in the shelter had to put in more mental and physical work to save their lives because of the deadline. George, Rick, the tenants, And even the dogs Max and Toby formed closer ties as their home turned into a common mission. Rick heard a knock on the door in the morning as he was putting together their final presentation for the municipal council. With a notebook in one hand and a flash drive in the other, Josh's typically apprehensive expression was replaced by a uncommon feeling of assurance. "I completed the movie." Josh's voice was steady, and Josh nodded. Rick cocked an eyebrow, and I scribbled down what I felt we should say. People need to see the reality. What this location means to us. I even spoke with a few of our supportive neighbors, and they stated they would speak up if required. Rick grinned and put a hand on Josh's shoulder. "Nice job, dude. Let's see. What you have is a raw yet impactful movie that combines resident testimonies with shelter footage." Josh had incorporated footage of Max and Toby protecting the refuge at night as part of his daily life, highlighting the. In the meantime, Paul had taken it upon himself to rally the residents for the shelter's objective of providing refuge and hope. He made a roster as the last step to make sure everyone had some sort of contribution, whether it was cooking, cleaning, or contacting supporters, including some who at first questioned their prospects but were enticed to participate in the group endeavor. Max and Toby became resilient role models for, with his unwavering stare and protective instincts. The group maxim personified the. Toby's continued development in his profession served as a reminder of the strength they aspired to. When the residents got together for dinner one evening, Paul realized that even the tiniest deeds of bravery may have a significant impact. Told a startling tale, saying, "As you are all aware, I was in a bad place when I first came here." His voice started out steady, but soon, Max's willingness to sit with me as if he understood what I was going through shifted my perspective and helped me understand I wasn't alone. The room went quiet as Paul's words took hold of me, and then Rick interrupted. "This location transforms individuals, and we must demonstrate to the council that as the days went by, the shelter had a surprise visit from Margaret, the proprietor of a local bakery, who showed up with boxes of sweets and irresolute. I noticed the expression on her face when she told George on the news segment that this refuge has been a community asset, whether or not people acknowledge it, and I want to assist." When Margaret needed help, she contacted her network of small company owners, many of whom were. Some even offered to provide food and supplies for an upcoming open house event in order to show their support for the shelter. The open house became a big focus for the group Josh worked on in order to demonstrate to the council the shelter's beneficial effects. Paul was working on his video while Rick and George organized a tour to show off the shelter's amenities. On the evening before the event, some of the more reserved residents managed to contribute, while others prepared statements. House George, sitting by himself in his office, reviewed the last details. Max and Toby was lying at his feet, and their peaceful presence was consoling. Rick knocked on the door and came in with. Rick placed a mug in front of George and stated, "You've been here all day, so it's time for you to take a break. I just want this to go smoothly. We can't afford to mess up." Rick sat across from him, leaning back in his chair and massaging his temples. His calm demeanor indicates that we've done everything we can. George grinned slightly and reached down to pat Max's head, saying, "This place is worth fighting for. It's not only about the shelter. What we've constructed here is about all of us." Rick nodded, "And we're not losing it, but not without a struggle." The open house yielded many of. People arrived, including local business owners, neighbors, and even a few city council members, including Margaret's. Josh's video moved many participants to tears, and the pastries were a smash, but the event's high point was when Rick and Toby first met, he told them how Max had saved him, and George explained how Toby had discovered. For Max to safeguard the shelter, the dog's bravery and devotion struck an emotional chord with everyone present. Ultimately, the shelter received numerous letters of support and financial help commitments, but more significantly, the event had brought the locals together in support of their cause that evening. After celebrating, George ended up watching the stars. Rick from the porch joined him as he leaned against the railing. "You did well today," Rick murmured. "Warm we all did," George said, glancing down at Max and Toby, who were lying next to him. Rick laughed, especially at the way their eyes reflected the moonlight. The shelter was humming with excitement the morning after the open house because the event's success had subsided. Everyone's moods, and there was a sincere feeling of hope for the first time in weeks, but the approaching city council. As the final decision drew near, passions were high and the meeting remained a formidable challenge. George stood speaking to the group while holding a clipboard in the middle of the common area. The open house was a huge improvement, but Rick nodded. It's not the end. Tomorrow is the council meeting, and we need to make sure we're fully prepared. They will pose difficult questions, and we must be able to clearly respond to them. We cannot afford to allow our feelings rule us. Paul, what if they bring up the complaints? The ones about the noise and the stray. The normally stoic man raised his hand. We've done everything we can to address those problems, but George is still running a hand through his graying hair. The shelter's renovations and the letters of support we've received should help offset those disagreements, but we must maintain composure and adhere to the truth. Josh, sitting in the corner with his laptop, chiming in. I've finished editing and prepared all the open house film. Everything the neighborhood supports, the beneficial effects on locals, Max, and George grinned at Josh for his efforts in keeping the shelter secure. Paul, the pressure started to get to everyone as the meeting drew nearer, and the video might be the turning point. Late into the night, Rick and Josh practiced their remarks, and Josh carefully reviewed the tape to make sure there were. Without any problems, Margaret dropped by with more pastries, some words of encouragement, and her upbeat demeanor couldn't quite eliminate the tense vibe Max and Toby appear to perceive. The protector remained. Toby is still learning from George's wife, whose vigilant eyes are always sweeping the room as though to protect him from invisible dangers. Following Max's example, his instructor would occasionally prod the inmates with his nose as though to reassure them of the day. George stood as the meeting began and the shelter's occupants assembled in the courtyard, prepared to go to City Hall. This is it, he said, his composed manner at the front concealing the dread he felt. No matter what happens today, know that we've done everything we could, he said steadily. Max and Toby rode in the back of two vans with the group, and regardless of the result, I'm proud of you all. The moment hung heavy in the air as they drove in silence in George's pickup to City Hall. As he got closer to the massive structure, George looked at the dogs in his rearview mirror and muttered, "This is for all of us." There was tension in the council chamber, which was crowded with shelter supporters, and the council members sat at a large table at the front with a few outspoken opponents, their faces bland as Josh was ready to show the film at the podium as George, Ulrich, and Paul took their seats, eager to hear the argument. At the right time, Max and Toby stayed outside while being watched over by a volunteer. However, those who understood their importance could feel their absence. The council chair was a formidable woman with a stern, "We are here to talk about the future of the community shelter on Maple Street, Mr. G.E." And he brought the meeting to order. "You have the floor, Joe R. Harris." George walked forward, his heart racing, took a big breath and started talking, saying, "Thank you, Madam Chair. This shelter has been a haven for people for more than 10 years. For animals alike, it serves as a healing space in addition as a place to sleep." As George talked, he could sense the pressure of the room on him to rebuild and locate hope. He highlighted the benefits that shelters provide to the community, including jobs and a safe haven for people in need. The adjustments they made to resolve grievances and emphasized the tremendous amount of support they got. When it came time for Rick to speak at the open house, he related how Max had saved his life, and Paul spoke steadily as he explained the sense of purpose he felt and how the shelter had given him a second opportunity. When Josh finally played the movie while working at the shelter, the room collapsed. Quiet as the video captured the faces of the local volunteers and community members who had come out to support. The film concluded with a view of Max and Toby standing next to one another, their eyes full with unflinching. George's fists were clenched as the council discussed loyalty because the tension in the chamber was nearly intolerable. While Josh tapped his foot, Rick sat with his head bowed in quiet prayer, his thoughts racing with worst-case scenarios. The chair of the council anxiously brought the meeting to order after reviewing the evidence and hearing the arguments made today. And even while we respect the worries expressed by certain community members, we are unable to. George held his breath as the chair went on. refusing to acknowledge the great influence this shelter has had on so many lives. This council has decided to give the shelter an additional year to extend its lease with the potential renewal pending additional assessment. The crowd erupted in cheers as the supporters of the shelter applauded and gave each other hugs. George's eyes stung with tears as the relief swept over him. As they exited the room, Max and Rick gave him a pat on the back while beaming broadly. George knelt next to Max, while Toby welcomed them with happy barks and wagging tails. "How you were a part of this too, kid?" he whispered quietly, caressing his ears. "We couldn't have done it without you." A sense of relief washed over the shelter's team as they left City Hall, but they were aware of the truth. The council's decision gave them a 1-year extension while the work was just getting started. But there was a catch. To obtain a loan, they had to show quantifiable gains in financial stability and community connections. George assembled the group in the common area of the shelter's permanent lease, and the mood was a mixture of, "We won a battle, but it's not the war George started. The council gave us an opportunity, but we've should demonstrate to them that we deserve it," which entails demonstrating that this location is not merely a sanctuary of refuge, but rather a pillar of our community. Rick folded his arms and leaned against the wall. "What's the plan, George? We have a year, but we must not waste any time," Paul stated in a firm voice. "Need to maintain the momentum we've established after the open house demonstrated our values." The group worked late into the night to come up with a story about bringing them into the shelter with Max and Toby. Thoughts and community happenings effortlessly flowed while lying contentedly by the fireside. Outreach initiatives and collaborations with nearby companies to address the persistent issues with noise and stray animals. Margaret, who is now an unofficial advisor, proposed setting up. "I'll speak with the diner about the shelter's dedication to the neighborhood through a monthly community cleanup. We can fund some of the activities and spread the word, George," she suggested, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Nodded and took notes. "That's a terrific concept, Rick, Paul, and Margaret. Let's get started." Organizing seminars is necessary for people to realize the abilities and worth we provide. The upcoming weeks were the shelter's first community cleanup was a flurry of activity, with volunteers from the local neighborhood, and even some Max and Toby, neighbors who joined in, were the stars of the show since they were wearing bright vests that read "Shelter Ambassadors." With their amusing antics, the event brought joy and broke down boundaries. And as the shelter's awareness increased, so did its supporters. A nearby veterinary clinic provided free examinations for needy pets, and a tiny bakery donated the money raised from In addition to raising money, the project's special Max and Toby cookie sale to the shelter altered people's perspectives. However, everyone believed that Clyde, the sour neighbor who had been outspoken about, he confronted George one afternoon because his grievances were still bothering them. "This doesn't alter anything," Clyde complained as he was strolling Max and Toby close to the shelter, pointing at a leaflet describing the shelter's recent accomplishments. "No matter how much you try to make this place seem nice, it's still an annoyance." George let out a sigh while maintaining his cool. "Clyde, I understand that you have some reservations, but I would like you to see. Why not attend our upcoming event and meet the people here to see what we're doing firsthand?" Clyde crossed his arms and scowled, saying, "We'll see how much good this place is doing." Walking away in spite of some people's opposition, the shelter remained successful. Toby, motivated by Max's steadfast devotion, he had started to shine on his own, became a friend to the kids that came to the shelter, and his playful demeanor made needy families happy. Max, one night while the protector watched over the grounds, his presence a continual source of solace and security. As George got ready for bed, he was surprised by a tap at the door. When he opened it, he saw Clyde standing there with a basket of. Clyde started his tone with veggies from his garden. "I thought about what you said. Sincere but stern. I'll attend your next event." However, George grinned. "I only asked that he extend his hand." "Thank you, Clyde. I'll see you next weekend." Clyde went to the shelter's Family Day celebration, which included live music, food, and activities. He observed from a distance as Max and Toby happily waved their towels to greet guests, softening Clyde's frown. Margaret came over as he seen Toby playing with some kids, his playful barks resonating like music. With a kind smile, she continued, You look like you could use one of these on this plate of homemade cookies." Clyde paused before. "Thank you," he said, accepting a cookie, his voice a little lower than normal for the first time. Remained until the event's conclusion, even assisting with cleanup after the audience had left. As the months passed, when Clyde's harshest critics started lending his gruff personality, the shelter's influence only grew, softening with every encounter. Max and Toby's relationship was crucial to the shelter's success, as they witnessed everything. Everyone who met them, including George, couldn't help but feel proud of what the refuge had become, more than he had ever thought possible, a representation of community, resiliency, and the indestructible relationship between people and animals. When winter arrived in the city, a gentle covering of snow covered everything. Although the shelter had made significant progress since its fragile state months prior, the last test was still imminent. Yearly council review that would decide whether to renew the lease indefinitely as of the date contacted George, and the group put in countless hours to complete their research, gathering community testimonies, members' financial documents documenting the shelter's outreach initiatives and demonstrating its increased stability. As a last act of appreciation and hope, the shelter conducted a candlelit vigil the evening before the review. Dozens of supporters and their adopted pets gathered in the snowy courtyard. With candles in hand, volunteers, and even skeptics like Clyde assembled. Maxon, with their golden fur glistening in the fading light. Toby stood next to George. Margaret led the group in soft hymn. Despite the warm atmosphere, her voice carried over the quiet night with a sense of promise. As the throng scattered, George stayed by the fire pit and stared into the embers. Max, because he couldn't get over his nervousness. Toby soon joined, curling up at George's feet. "And we've done it," he said, rubbing his head into George's hand, as George stroked their fur and muttered, "Everything we can, lads. Now it's out of our." Early the following morning, George, Ricard Paul, and Margaret stood outside City Hall. The air was acrid. As he gazed at the massive doors, George's breath clouded in front of him. Max and Toby were not permitted inside, but they lingered nearby, their eyes steadfastly loyally focused on George within the council. There was tension in the room as council members shuffled papers. George and the crew made their point, one by one, using unreadable phrases. Rick emphasized the financial implications of the shelter, while Margaret spoke strongly about its importance in the community. George took a deep breath and finally turned the room around. He said steadily, "A shelter isn't just a haven for stray pets or struggling people. It's a symbol of what we can accomplish when we band together. And Max and Toby are evidence that they have taught us the values of love, courage, and commitment." George continued by saying, "Qualities we've tried to reflect in every step we've taken this year." Whispered to one other, and the mayor, a stern man known for his practicality, stepped up to speak. "We appreciate your presentation, and we'll discuss it with you before letting you know what we decide." The wait felt eternal. Max and Toby dutifully waited outside each time, while George and the team sat in a neighboring cafe drinking coffee. When the door opened, and it wasn't the council messenger, finally a young clerk, George's heart leaped, only to fall. She went over to Mr. George Carter with an envelope and requested him to get up. He accepted the mail with shaky hands, and the crew gathered around him as he carefully opened it. The letter was short, but George read aloud the words that made him cry. "The council has voted to grant the shelter a permanent lease." The cafe burst into applause, and Margaret gave George a firm hug in return. Supporters and volunteers flocked to the shelter to celebrate and offer food as word spread like wildfire, with kids covering them in decorations and heartfelt congrats. Max and Toby got more attention than ever. Flowers and ribbons. Clyde came up to George with a dish of steaming cocoa, and then he gave me an unusually embarrassed smile and said, "I guess I was wrong about this place." George grinned and clapped his cup against Clyde's takes on the village, saying, "Here, you've done something really special, and now you're a part of ours." George stood in the celebration as the sun went down, observing Max and Toby playing in the courtyard with a group of kids that the shelter had not only managed to keep alive, but had become a pillar of the community, and George was extremely appreciative of everyone who helped make it happen. However, the celebration of the shelter went on late into the night, especially for the two dogs who had started it all. George felt incredibly fulfilled as he observed the community that evening as the fire pit flared in the courtyard. Max and Toby were at the middle of it all, wagging their tails as they came together. During the celebrations, a woman in her late 30s reveled in the warmth of the people they had assisted in bringing together. Walked up to George, her face showing a mix of anxiety and optimism, and she identified herself as Dr. Emily Harper, A. Having just returned to the city, the veterinarian had been watching the shelter's progress and was motivated by Emily's voice, earnest, and these two said, "I wanted to meet the man behind this incredible place because of its transformation." George laughed and scratched Max behind the ears, saying, "Amazing dogs, they're the real deal. I'm just trying to keep up with them. Heroes," he added, waving toward Toby as well. Emily grinned and knelt down to pet the "I wanted to know if you would think about extending the shelter services for dogs," she added. "With my background, I could assist in establishing a veterinary clinic on the property where we could provide care for needy animals and even." George's eyes widened as he discussed spay and neuter services to curb overpopulation. The idea was fantastic and a logical next step for the shelter. "I'd be honored to work with you," he continued in an emotionally charged voice, and Emily nodded. The evening took yet another unexpected turn when a youngster showed signs of eagerness. "Let's make it happen." Cautiously walked up to George, clutching a tiny notebook to his chest, and glanced anxiously at Max and Toby. George bent down to look him in the eye and murmured, "Hello, George," softly. "What's your name?" "Liam," the youngster said quietly. He paused, then held out the notepad in which I had written this for Max and Toby. When George opened the notebook, he discovered a touching letter from Liam, written in an unreadable handwriting, detailing how Max and Toby's tale had encouraged him to have courage and kindness even in the face of felt difficult. And he concluded the letter by saying, "Thank you for demonstrating to me that strength does not equate to loneliness." As he read, his throat constricted. He glanced at Liam, and his voice was full with emotion. "Is lovely, Liam. Thank you." When George gave Liam a pen, his expression brightened. George laughed. "You sign it for me, and perhaps Max and Toby could sign it too." Toby followed Liam's instructions and pressed one of Max's paws onto the paper, departing. Liam grinned while holding the notebook, and there were two paw prints next to George's signature. George found himself by himself with Max and Toby by the fire as the festivities came to an end and people started to go. George leaned back in his chair and gazed up at the courtyard as pit's embers flared dimly, casting a warm light. "Everything has changed because of the stars," he added quietly, his voice filled with awe and thankfulness, not simply. Max nuzzled George's hand while Toby laid his, not only for me, but for the entire community, head on George's lap, his gentle brown eyes full of faith, and their relationship was unbreakable, strengthened by love and formed by adversity. While George sat there, he closed his eyes and silently thanked the shooting star that flashed across the sky. He realized that no matter what force brought Max and Toby into his life, there would always be obstacles to overcome, encounter, but knowing that he wasn't alone, he felt prepared to meet them. The morning following the celebration, George woke up too. He went outdoors to see Toby and Max playing in the yard as he heard birds chirping and Max barking excitedly. The events of the previous night came back to him, and he smiled as their happy spirit filled the clear morning air. Pulled at his lips, the shelter had evolved from a place where animals may find safety to a beacon of hope for the. George considered the progress made by the entire community since that awful night when Max first entered his life had begun as a grudging gesture of goodwill and had grown into a mission of healing and compassion driven by the relationship he had with his two devoted friends. The new veterinary clinic swiftly took shape because of, with the help of volunteers motivated by Emily's shelter tale and the commitment of Dr. Harper, she worked relentlessly to transform her idea into a reality, and the clinic was prepared to operate in a matter of weeks. The ribbon-cutting celebration attracted a crowd, and Max and Toby, the official mascots of the shelter, who were dressed in bright red bandanas, stole the show. After hearing so much about Liam, people who had previously been terrified of dogs suddenly came to the shelter in anticipation of seeing the two heroes. Became a regular visitor learning about the maintenance of the animals and assisting with their feeding. He even established a little, "You have a great team here, Emily," gathering supplies and money for the shelter at his school. One time, while seeing the dogs play with the kids, Max and Toby said to George that they had a way of bringing out. George nodded, his face thoughtful, reminding us of the finest in everyone. He asserted that love, devotion, and the guts to change things are what truly count. Over time, the shelter increased its outreach by holding adoption events and community education seminars on proper pet ownership. Families from all across the region came to see the animals, and many of them ended up finding permanent homes. The town took pride in the shelter's accomplishments, and even the most doubtful citizens began to value them. Its effect one evening, while George sat with Max and Toby on the veranda, he thought about, on the path that led them to this point, the struggles they endured together, the lives they impacted, and it appears that we have created something truly unique here. George and the love they had shared had all been worthwhile. Toby, with his tail wagging wildly, barked in agreement as he scratched Max's ears. Max rested on George's side, his cozy presence serving as a reminder of the amazing bond they had created with Toby. It felt peaceful on the farm, yet at George's feet, his faint snores blended with the soft hum of the evening. George raised his glass as the stars started to glimmer in the night sky, full of life and the promise of fresh starts. Of iced tea in an unspoken ode to Max, Toby, and the altered path. Do you think that love and loyalty have the same strength as Max and Toby did throughout their lives? If so, please share your thoughts with us. If you like this story, please leave a comment below. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and please press the notification bell to ensure that you never miss another motivational tale like this one. Thank you for viewing, and we'll see you soon in the upcoming adventure.